They didn't whisper it. They said it like a verdict, with the casual certainty of people who believe they are simply passing along the natural order of things. Too dark. 2 words that try to fold a life into a boundary line. 2 words that knock on the ribs of a boy who has not yet learned how to refuse entry to other people's opinions. But consider the miracle of this, that a boy grows into a man and the boundary becomes a runway, and the verdict becomes a laugh line that doesn't bend him. And the same people who once refused to see him now sit in the dark, rose in silence, and watch his face light up a screen the size of a building. The world calls it stardom. He calls it breath returning to a body that spent years holding it. Listen closely to his story, and you'll hear 2 timelines. In the first, there's the grind. School fees paid in installments. Day jobs that leave grease and dust under the nails. A pocket notebook where lines get scribbled when there is just barely enough light on a bus ride home. In the second, there's a quieter revolt. A man refusing to lighten his skin to dull the brightness of who he is. Refusing to swap his face for a mask that has been mass-produced for so long it's become invisible. The boy who was told he would never be a hero, without the glow of a tube-lit fairness. Cream grew into a man who made his darkness the light by which other people finally learned to see. This is a story about colorism and its crooked math, about how the world measures worth with a ruler that was never straight, and about the choice repeated daily, hour by hour, to keep showing up. It's the story of an actor whose talent made it impossible to keep him in the background, and whose very presence on a poster is a small resurrection for every kid who ever avoided mirrors, because the mirror always returned someone deemed too much for this world. Too dark, too real, too undeniable. He was told he was not meant to be seen. He refused and became a light. He was born where the land holds heat, in a village that seemed to breathe with the seasons, sugarcane rattling, wheat swaying like ocean, the smell of rain far off and then suddenly there, and a sky that reached down into the fields until the fields felt like part of the sky. The house was not large, but it yielded to the family's needs like a patient animal. Walls holding the noise of siblings, a courtyard that collected laughter and arguments, and the metallic clink of a cup set down a little too hard. There was no glamour. There was pride, the kind that comes from finishing the day's work and still finding enough grace left over to share food with a neighbor and advice with a child. School was less an institution than a determined effort. Shoes wore out and were stitched back up. Fees were a problem solved with the ingenuity of people who cannot afford to run out of options. He studied chemistry because it was solid, a subject you could point to when someone asked, "What will you do to survive?" He learned to love the quiet logic of formulas, the neat violence of reactions. In a flask, at least, you knew what to expect. Out in the world, reactions were messier. In the village, color was not an abstraction. It was gossip in the marketplace, an auntie's unguarded remark about a baby's shade, a marriage ad coded in synonyms for fair, an elder's advice offered with care and poison at once. Stay out of the sun. Drink turmeric milk. Rub this paste, pray. He went to the city because ambition is a form of migration. Work came in shards, a laboratory job where his talent was measured in shifts, not dreams. A security post that traded daylight for survival. Rented rooms where sleep had to be coaxed out of noise. And then theater found him, or perhaps he found theater. The way parched soil finds rain when the monsoon finally arrives. The stage offered an honesty the rest of life couldn't manage. Under lights he put on other names and discovered, to his surprise, that each one fit better than the name the world had given him. Not handsome enough. Not light enough. Not easily sold. He learned to use his body like an instrument, to let silence play as loudly as a line, to breathe with an audience until time itself loosened its grip. He trained. The way a wrestler trains by learning how to fall without breaking. The way a singer trains by learning to listen harder than she sings. He found mentors who admired what didn't fit the mold, and friends who shared food and rent and rehearsal time. Nights he memorized monologues in stairwells that smelled of damp concrete and leftover dinners. Mornings he walked into auditions where the room measured him in seconds. One glance to place him, another to erase him, the third to decide. "We'll call you," they said. And sometimes later they did, but only to stand him in the background and let the camera pass over his face like it was scenery. There isn't a single event that builds a wall. There is mortar mixed of 1,000 small humiliations, smoothed over the years, until the structure looks like part of the landscape. He remembers one audition with the clarity of a wound. The casting assistant had been kind in the way people sometimes are when they've already decided against you. "You're very talented," she said, her eyes still on his photo. "But the brief says fair." He tried to smile. "I can't change that." She tilted her head, sympathetic but unmoved. "Of course. We'll keep you in mind for character roles." He knew what that meant. A criminal or a clown. A servant or a shadow. The kind of roles where the skin becomes shorthand for the story. And the story never belongs to the man wearing it. Another time, makeup artist patted his cheeks with powder and muttered about undertones, then turned to the assistant and asked for a lighter foundation because the camera would thank them. He sat there and thought of the village, of afternoons so bright the whole world looked like it had been scrubbed, and wondered how a lens could be more fragile than a human eye. He wanted to ask, what if the camera learned to see? But technology is never the only problem. Vision is. Years later, when young actors told him similar stories, he would shake his head and tell them to buy their own foundation in their own shade and carry it with them like a small revolution in a zippered bag. The industry had well-worn phrases. Wheatish, dusky, sharp features. Each phrase was a disguise for hierarchy, a polite way of continuing a colonial lesson about who deserves to be looked at and who should move out of frame. He learned to spot which directors had started to unlearn the lesson and which ones still clung to it. He learned that there are two kinds of no, the one that saves your soul and the one that sells it. He learned to survive lean years without letting scarcity sign on as a permanent tenant in his heart. But there were also days of oxygen, tiny parts that asked for more than a stereotype. Long walks home after midnight where the city seemed suddenly to be rooting for him. He would swing a plastic bag with a cold drink he couldn't afford last year, and his feet would tap out lines for tomorrow's audition on cracked sidewalks. There were moments in rehearsal halls when everything clicked, when the director's cue met his breath exactly right, and a room of 6 people went quiet in that pleasure you get when something trues itself. There were film sets where the light crew smiled at him like they knew how hard this was, and a senior actor squeezed his shoulder and said, "Make them watch." The insult, when it came loudest, was always disguised as advice. "You should try a creamy base," one assistant director suggested, as if recommending a sandwich shop. "It will open doors." He nodded, and later, in a bathroom that smelled of disinfectant and stress, he looked at his face in the mirror and made a choice. He would not scrub himself into someone else's comfort. He would walk into rooms in the color the sun gave him, and he would walk out if that color was a problem. He could not afford pride in everything. He could afford it in this. There is a kind of resistance that looks like a speech, a march, a petition. There is another kind that looks like staying. He stayed. He took the anonymous roles, the man at the tea stall, the informer in the half-shadow, the arm of a mob, because rent does not care how principled you are. And then he went home and sharpened his tools. In rehearsal, he would turn 3 lines into a character, 1 gesture into a history. He learned to audit a script like an accountant, finding where a scene could be balanced better, where a moment of truth could be smuggled in without setting off alarms. Friends fell away, some to other cities, some to silence. The ones who remained built a kind of family that did not need a surname. They shared contacts, warnings, and the stubborn, irrational optimism of people who have nothing to recommend them but their work. He refused fairness cream commercials despite the money, because he knew what it felt like to be 12 and surrounded by adults talking about how a girl could fix her face the way you patch a wall. He would not be the voice that kept that lie alive in someone else's home. The roles improved by inches and then by feet. A director with a taste for punk and poetry cast him in something that did not ask him to disappear. A small scene in a thriller cracked open like a geode in the edit bay and showed him shining at the center. Audiences leaned forward. Critics who sometimes cannot bring themselves to love what regular people love, loved him anyway. They called him a revelation in the kind of glowing prose they usually reserve for people who look like the posters that have hung in their heads since childhood. For the first time, he did not feel like a guest in his own line of work. The world kept trying to tell him what his face meant. He answered with work. He built an arsenal of looks that could undress a lie from across the room, a way of pausing before a line that made the line hit harder, a laugh that, depending on where he placed it, could make the audience feel safe or very, very uneasy. He stopped asking whether the gatekeepers would let him in and started asking whether he could build something sturdy, enough that other people could climb it after he was done. Resistance also meant speaking aloud what everyone knew but had learned to discuss only in kitchens. He said the obvious things on the record about colorism, about how scripts create worlds and then pretend that those worlds are real life, and he said them calmly, as if naming a fact should not always have to feel like a fight. He doesn't consider himself an activist in the way that word gets tossed around, but he does consider himself accountable to the boy he was, to the kids watching, to the craft that saved him from having to be anyone else. The breakthrough, when it arrived, did not feel like a lottery ticket. It felt like a balance due. A pair of films released too close together to be coincidence put him in the kind of light no argument can extinguish. He played men who were nothing like the mannequins that once lined studio hallways. They were complex, morally alive, sometimes terrifying, always real. In one, he was a thread that pulled a thriller tight. In another, he blew open a gangster epic with the kind of force you can't choreograph. And then came a love story. Not the syrupy kind, but the one that moves like a quiet river and becomes, without a fuss, a sea. He played a man who made lunch and made meaning and made a woman, and a city feel seen in a way that had nothing to do with fantasy and everything to do with, dignity, as these characters took their first breaths in front of audiences. Rooms around the world shifted. It was not only the applause that told the tale. It was the way people described him afterward. No longer unconventional, no longer surprising, he became necessary. Directors began to write with him in mind, knowing that an ordinary moment would not remain ordinary in his hands. He began to get the kind of phone calls that, years earlier, he had stopped waiting for because waiting had started to feel too much like begging. He walked red carpets he once watched on TV in the rented room with peeling paint. The same face, the same skin drinking in flashbulbs, as if they were only a brighter version of the village sun. Photographers shouted his name with the frantic friendliness they reserve for men who can sell magazines. He smiled, not because the attention healed him, but because it proved something. An audience can be taught what to want. If you feed them only one flavor, they will ask for it by habit. Give them a taste of the rest of the world, and they will learn to crave that, too. In those years, he also stepped onto a set that wasn't cinema but felt like it. A series that laid the city bare and rebuilt it in 8 episodes. The camera loved him there, loved the way he could sit still and imply continence of intent. People who had never heard his name before now said it in the same breath as men, whose faces had once dominated the posters. He had become, in the script of the world, the punctuation other actors had to reckon with. Success does not erase what came before, but it changes the map. He returned to the village not as a prince but as a son. He walked the unchanged roads and felt the changed weight of his footsteps. Young men asked him questions they didn't know how to ask their fathers, how to leave without abandoning, how to dream without being rude to reality. He told them the truth, that the odds were bad, that the long odds can be beaten, that neither fact cancels the other. He opened a door or two where he could. He kept a small circle who told him when he was wrong and didn't flinch when he was right. The industry adjusted. Not out of generosity, but because audiences demanded it. Scripts began to hold room for men who looked like him to be lovers and leaders, comedians and kings, sons and sinners. Not as scenery, not as spice, but as the main dish. The fairness market, once an unchallenged behemoth, began to blush under the new light. Brands scrubbed their language. Not always their logic, but progress has always advanced with 2 steps forward and a wobble. He turned down offers that wanted his face without his voice, that tried to cast him as a fig leaf, for changes the gatekeepers had not actually made. He talked often about what it meant to be seen and what it meant to see. He visited film schools where he recognized the ache in a student's posture as his own past. He told them that talent is a muscle, and taste is a compass, and neither works without practice. He told them to write themselves the roles no one would give them. He told them to carry their own shade of foundation in their bag, and their own shade of truth in their mouth. He told them that the lesson the world has tried to teach them, that lighter is better, is a lie so old it has learned to sound like tradition. Tradition is just a habit with a costume. At home, life folded into ordinary miracles. Mornings that did not begin in fear, nights that ended with a book instead of a worry, a kitchen with spices he could smell in rooms that he owned. He was deliberate about this part, about being a person and not a projection. He cooked for friends. He turned off his phone. He learned to say no, not as a reprimand to the world, but as a yes to himself. The kid who had taken 100 buses to get to a rehearsal was still there. He just rode a different route now. The world kept making noise about skin, about beauty, about which faces look like the future. He kept answering with work that made the debate look silly. He played men who loved poorly and learned better, men who let violence make instruments of their hands and then had to live with the music, men who stumbled through the world with the kind of grace only failure teaches. He warmed to the knowledge that the best stories are not about goodness but growth, and that growth is not gentle, but worth it. You can measure a life by what it refuses to concede. The boy who was told too dark refused to concede himself to other people's sightlines. He learned instead to carry his own light, and in doing so lit the path for others. It is tempting to plot his story as a triangle, pain to persistence to prize. But that flattens how hard it is day after day to hold on to the conviction that you are worth the work. He held on. That is the entire heroism and the entire instruction. What do we do with his story? We examine our reflexes, the ones that push fair to the top of the vocabulary list, and teach children to categorize themselves before they know how to tie their shoes. The ones that make us say unconventional when we mean I never. Learned to see this as beautiful, and now I am embarrassed by my own eyes. We ask what our screens have taught us about who gets to be adored and who gets to be tolerated. We ask how wage sheets and casting grids and HR pipelines reproduce the same faces again and again and call it merit. We ask, and then we answer with practice. Whose voices do we buy tickets for? What companies do we refuse to fund with our attention? What children do we praise out loud in the shade they came in? If you are a teacher, ask yourself which child's face you interpret as mischief and which as menace. If you are a parent, throw out the jokes about shade before they learn to repeat them. If you are a maker of films, of ads, of culture, interrogate which market realities are just old prejudices in a spreadsheet. And if you are a kid who has been told that you are too much of anything, too dark, too loud, too real, remember this. The world is a classroom that sometimes gives detention for joy. Keep your joy anyway. Carry your own foundation, your own script, your own map. Walk into rooms that were not built with you in mind, and make them yours by the simple, stubborn act of staying. They called him too dark and meant to keep him out of the light. Instead, he learned to be his own light, and then he shared it. Now, in the dark of a theater, people who once would have passed him on the street without recognition sit quietly and let his face teach them how to see. That is not a miracle. That is a man at last being seen for what he always was. And in that seeing, a world beginning, however slowly, to heal.